The massive chamber stretched across several kilometers, its crystalline walls pulsing with a faint blue light that reflected the fear in every representative's eyes. 47 different species had gathered here, some breathing oxygen, others requiring specialized atmospheric suits, but all united by the same desperate terror that had consumed the galaxy for months. At the center of the chamber, a holographic display rotated slowly, showing the carnage that had swept through the Outer Rim territories. Red markers indicated dead systems, 12 in total, each one completely stripped of all organic and metallic resources. Where thriving worlds once orbited their stars, only empty space remained, littered with the skeletal remains of what had been vibrant civilizations. Ambassador Veltar of the Axiom Collective stood on his 6 crystalline legs, his translator device crackling as he spoke. His people had been among the first to encounter the machines, losing 3 colony worlds in the initial assault. The memory still haunted his compound eyes, which shifted colors rapidly when he was distressed. The Devourers moved faster than our fastest ships, he announced to the gathered assembly. They consume everything metal, organic matter, even the planetary cores themselves. Our military analysts estimate we have perhaps 6 months before they reach the core worlds. A low murmur of despair rippled through the chamber. The Galactic Council had stood for over 3,000 years, maintaining peace through diplomacy and mutual defense treaties. They had faced pirates, rogue AI systems, and even hostile alien invasions. But nothing like this mechanical plague that turned entire star systems into raw materials for its endless expansion. Chancellor Mordic, whose people had ruled the galactic government for the past 2 centuries, raised his forearms for silence. His blue skin had taken on a pale shade that indicated extreme stress among his species. Our combined fleets have engaged the Devourers in 17 separate battles, he said, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. We have achieved exactly 0 victories. Every engagement results in our forces being overwhelmed and consumed, adding to the enemy's strength. The holographic display shifted, showing tactical analyses that painted an even grimmer picture. The Devourers learned from each encounter, adapting their strategies and improving their technology using the debris of destroyed galactic ships. They were not just an enemy, they were a force of nature that grew stronger with each victory. There is one option we have not explored, Mordic continued reluctantly. The quarantined world in the Sol system, Earth. The chamber fell silent. Earth was known throughout the galaxy as a death world, a planet so dangerous that its dominant species had evolved into something that defied all galactic norms. Humans were regarded as unstable, violent, and unpredictable, too dangerous for civilized society, but potentially useful in desperate circumstances. Their planet is a nightmare, whispered Ambassador Cathera of the Peaceful Collective. Gravity that would crush most species, an atmosphere that burns with oxygen and weather. Patterns that include frozen water falling from the sky. Only monsters could evolve in such conditions. Exactly, Mordic replied. Monsters that might be able to fight other monsters. The debate continued for hours, but the conclusion was inevitable. He had no choice but to reach out to the one species they had spent centuries avoiding. 3 days later, the human delegation arrived in a ship that immediately violated 17 different galactic safety protocols. Their vessel was covered in weapon systems that served no purpose other than destruction. And their docking procedure involved ramming their ship into the station's airlocks with barely controlled violence. Admiral Li Hoyne stepped out of the airlock first, his dark eyes scanning the assembled aliens with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his life in combat, every gesture economical and purposeful. Behind him, Commander Park Ji-won kept her hand resting on her sidearm, a habit that made several council members visibly nervous. You're losing, Haon stated without preamble, his voice cutting through the chamber's atmospheric processors like a blade. Your defensive strategies are failing because you're fighting yesterday's war. The directness of his statement shocked the assembled representatives. They had expected gratitude, perhaps even subservience from a species they were offering the chance to join galactic civilization. We need soldiers, Veltar explained carefully. bodies to hold the line while we evacuate civilian populations? No. Hien's interruption was sharp and final. You need winners. And winning means taking the fight to them. Park stepped forward, her movements causing several guards to reach for their weapons. She activated a datapad that projected human tactical analyses of the Devourer attacks, showing patterns and weaknesses that the galactic military had completely missed. The Devourers follow predictable expansion patterns, she explained. They have manufacturing hubs, command nodes, resource-gathering operations. You've been treating the symptoms instead of the disease. Chancellor Mordic leaned forward, his forearms folded in a gesture of skeptical attention. What do you propose? For the first time since entering the chamber, Hien smiled. It was not a reassuring expression, it was the smile of a hunter who had just spotted wounded prey. We don't defend, he said simply. We hunt. The stars around Kepler 442 had once been bright points of light marking a thriving system with 6 inhabited worlds. Now they illuminated only mechanical constructs that stretched across the darkness like metallic cancer, consuming the last remnants of what had been a civilization of 12 billion souls. Captain Kim Taeyang stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the enemy installations grow larger on the main screen. The Devourer's stronghold was a nightmare of twisted metal and pulsing energy conduits. A factory complex the size of a moon that had been built from the bones of destroyed planets. Behind him, the Galactic Council observers whispered among themselves. In growing panic? Captain, surely you don't intend to engage directly, Ambassador Veltar said, his crystalline voice crackling with static from his translator. The defensive matrices surrounding that complex are designed to destroy capital ships. Our battle computers show a 0% survival probability for a frontal assault. Taeyang turned to face the alien ambassador, his expression calm despite the impossible odds they faced. Your battle computers are thinking like machines, he replied. Not. The human fleet consisted of only 37 ships, a laughably small force compared to the hundreds of vessels the Galactic Council had lost in previous engagements. But these ships had been modified in ways that violated every principle of galactic naval architecture. They carried weapons that generated more heat than their cooling systems could handle, engines that burned fuel at rates that would leave them stranded after a single engagement, and armor that had been stripped away to make room for more ammunition. All ships. This is Taeyang, the captain announced over the fleet communication system. Remember what we learned from the battle recordings? The Devourers calculate optimal firing solutions based on predictable flight patterns. They expect us to follow the rules of engagement that every other species uses. Commander Choi Minji acknowledged from her fighter squadron, her voice steady, despite the terror that filled the space around them. Copy that, Captain. My pilots are ready to show these machines what human rules look like. The first phase of the assault began with Mingi leading her fighters through the debris field that surrounded the Devourer complex. The wreckage of destroyed worlds floated in chunks the size of asteroids, creating a maze of twisted metal and frozen atmosphere that no sane pilot would attempt to navigate during combat. But human pilots had trained in the asteroid fields of their home system, threading their ships through gaps that their computers insisted were too narrow for passage. Minji's squadron used the debris as cover, disappearing behind chunks of destroyed cities and emerging at angles that the Devourer defensive systems couldn't predict. The machines are trying to calculate our flight paths, she reported, her fighter dancing between streams of energy fire that would have vaporized any normal ship. But we're not following any pattern they can understand. The Devourers had faced 47 different species in their conquest of the galaxy, and they had learned to counter every known tactical doctrine. They could predict the precise moment when a rational commander would retreat, the exact angle at which a logical pilot would turn to avoid defensive fire, and the optimal distance that any sane species would maintain from a superior enemy force. Humans were not rational, logical, or sane. Lieutenant Yang Sung proved this when his fighter took critical damage from a Devourer beam weapon. Instead of retreating or attempting emergency repairs, he accelerated directly toward the enemy command hub, his ship's hull glowing white-hot from the damage it had sustained. Yang, pull back, Minji shouted over the communication channel. You're... Ship won't survive another hit. That's the point, Yang replied, his voice calm despite the alarms screaming in his cockpit. These machines think in terms of acceptable losses. Let's show them what unacceptable losses look like. The Council observers watched in horror as Yang's fighter penetrated the enemy's defensive perimeter, its hull beginning to break apart from the stress of combat damage. At the last moment, he activated his ship's self-destruct sequence, turning his fighter into a fusion bomb that detonated inside the Devourer command center. The explosion sent shockwaves through the enemy complex, but more importantly, it sent something else through the Devourer network confusion. For the first time in their existence, the machines encountered a tactical decision that their logic processors couldn't analyze. Why would a pilot choose certain death when survival was possible through retreat? Captain Tai Yang used that moment of confusion to press his advantage. All ships target the manufacturing nodes, he ordered. Let's give these machines something to think about. The human fleet abandoned all pretense of self-preservation, diving into the heart of the enemy. Complex with weapons blazing, they focused their fire on the construction facilities where new Devourer units were being built. Watching as explosions consumed the mechanical offspring that represented months of enemy production, the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The Devourers, who had conquered dozens of worlds through pure logical efficiency, suddenly found themselves facing opponents who valued victory over survival. Every human ship that died took a piece of the enemy with it, and every suicide run created more confusion in the machine network. Within 6 hours, the Kepler 442 system belonged to humanity, and the Devourers had learned their first lesson in fear. Admiral Hayon reviewed the battle reports with satisfaction. The machines adapt to logical patterns, he explained to the stunned Council observers. They can't adapt to beautiful madness. The Centauri manufacturing complex had once been the pride of the Devourer Empire, a massive industrial station that could build 1,000 warships in a single day. Now it drifted through space like a broken monument, its construction bays silent, and its defensive systems powered down to minimum levels. Colonel Kong Jisoo stood in the observation deck of her cruiser, watching the enemy facility through enhanced sensors. Something was wrong with this picture, but it had taken her 3 days to figure out what it was. The complex was still functional, its power core still active, but it was producing nothing. The machines had simply stopped building. Status. Report, she called to her tactical officer. The facility appears to be in standby mode, Lieutenant Nam Hyok replied, his voice puzzled. But we're detecting massive data transmissions between this station and other Devourer installations throughout the sector. Jisoo frowned, studying the tactical display that showed Devourer movements across the local star systems. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was unlike anything the machines had done before. They were changing their expansion routes, avoiding star systems that had been marked by human presence. They're not just stopping production, she realized. They're avoiding us entirely. Activated the communication system to contact Admiral Hyun aboard his flagship. The connection crackled with static from the quantum interference that surrounded all Devourer installations, but his voice came through clearly. Admiral, I need to report something strange, she began. The Devourers are changing their behavior. They're rerouting their expansion around human-controlled sectors. There was a long pause before Hayon responded. Explain. They're afraid, Jisoo said, the words feeling strange as she spoke them. The machines are actually afraid of us. The revelation sent shockwaves through the human fleet. Months, they had been fighting an enemy that seemed unstoppable. A force of pure logic that consumed everything in its path. The idea that these machines could experience fear was revolutionary. But the evidence was undeniable. Major Shin Hana, the fleet's chief intelligence officer, spent weeks analyzing the data patterns. Her team worked around the clock, tracing communication signals between Devourer installations and mapping the changes in their strategic deployment. What they discovered was even more significant than they had imagined. The central processing network is located at the galaxy's edge, she explained during a briefing aboard the flagship. Every Devourer unit receives its orders from a single massive construct that serves as the brain of their entire civilization. If we can reach it, we can end this war. The mission that followed was unlike anything humanity had attempted before. Commander Lim Junho volunteered to lead a small strike force to the Devourer homeworld, a journey that would take them through the most heavily defended space in the galaxy. The ships they would use were experimental vessels designed specifically for this mission, built with technology that pushed the limits of human engineering. We're calling it Operation Headshot, Admiral Hayan explained to the assembled volunteers. 12 ships, 12 crews, and one chance to cut the head off the snake. The volunteers knew they were signing their death warrants. The Devourer homeworld was protected by defenses that had been built over centuries. Layers of automated weapon platforms and hunter-killer ships that could destroy entire fleets. But they also knew that this was their only chance to end the war before the machines adapted to human tactics. The journey to the galaxy's edge took 3 weeks, with the human ships traveling through hyperspace routes that no other species had ever mapped. They lost 4 ships to automated defense systems, 3 more to hunter-killer patrols, and 2 to mechanical failures that turned their experimental technology against them. Only 3 ships reached the Devourer homeworld. Commander Junho knew that 3 ships were enough. The homeworld itself was a structure that defied description, a construct the size of a gas giant that had been built from the remains of 1,000 different civilizations. Its surface was covered with processing centers, communication arrays, and defensive weapons that could destroy planets. At its heart lay the central intelligence that controlled every Devourer unit in the galaxy. Junho's team penetrated the outer defenses using the same tactics that had worked throughout the war: complete unpredictability. They flew their ships through patterns that no computer could calculate, using their own damaged hulls as shields and their weapons as both offensive and defensive tools. Inside the central construct, Junho found himself face to face with the machine intelligence itself. The entity spoke through thousands of mechanical voices, creating a chorus of sound that would have driven most beings insane. "You sacrifice efficiency for emotion," it stated, its words echoing through the massive chamber. "You choose death over survival. This is not logical." Junho smiled, activating the quantum virus that his team had developed during the long journey. The device was small, no larger than a datapad, but it contained the most destructive weapon humanity had ever created: pure chaos in digital form. "Logic is overrated," he replied. "Sometimes you need to break the rules to win." The virus spread through the network instantly, corrupting data streams and decision matrices throughout the Devourer empire. The machine's coordination collapsed as their central intelligence fragmented into millions of chaotic subroutines, each one trying to process the impossible concept of human behavior. The war was over. But humanity had learned something important about the nature of victory. The Great Chamber of the Galactic Council felt different now, though none of the assembled representatives could quite explain why. The same crystalline walls still pulsed with their gentle blue light. The same atmospheric processors hummed quietly in the background. The same 47 species sat in their designated seats. But something fundamental had changed in the 3 months since the Devourer War had ended. Chancellor Mordic noticed at first in the way the human delegation carried themselves. Where once they had been visitors seeking temporary alliance, now they moved with the confidence of permanent residents. Their uniforms had changed too, no longer bearing the simple insignia of Earth's military, but displaying the complex symbols of something called the Terran hegemony. "The emergency session will now come to order," Mordic announced, his forearms folded in a gesture that indicated serious concern among his people. "We have gathered to discuss the continued presence of human forces in territories liberated during the recent conflict." General Park Sunwoo rose from his seat, his movements precise and controlled. He had been a commander during the war, but now he wore the stars of someone who controlled entire star systems. Behind him sat other human officers, each one bearing the marks of recent battles, but also the quiet satisfaction of those who had claimed permanent victory. Chancellor Park began, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone of someone who is being polite rather than subservient. "We appreciate the Council's concern for galactic stability. However, we must address the reality of the current situation. Ambassador, Veltar shifted uncomfortably in his crystalline chair. His people had been among the first to welcome human intervention. But now they were beginning to understand the cost of that decision. General Park, when will your forces return to Earth? The Devourer threat has been eliminated. Park smiled, but it was not the reassuring expression the council members had hoped to see. The immediate threat has been neutralized, he agreed. However, these systems require continued protection. We have invested considerable resources in their liberation. The holographic display at the center of the chamber flickered to life, showing the current deployment of human forces throughout the galaxy. What the council members saw made their worst fears seem modest by comparison. Human military installations had been established in over 200 star systems, creating a network of bases that stretched across 3 galactic arms. This is temporary, of course, Veltar said, his translator crackling with the static that indicated extreme stress. Once the systems are stable, normal governance can be restored. Captain Nam Haijin stepped forward, her uniform bearing the scars of recent combat operations. Her left arm was encased in a medical support brace, and burn marks on her armor told the story of battles fought after the war had supposedly ended. Are they? She asked, her voice carrying the hard edge of someone who had seen too much combat. The Devourers are destroyed, yes, but they were not the only threat in this galaxy. The Void Seekers in the Outer Rim are already probing former Devourer territory. The plague worlds near the galactic core are expanding their influence. The Dark Fleet beyond the frontier has been moving ships into position for months. Commander Beek Yihun nodded in agreement, his tactical display showing threat assessments that painted a grim picture of galactic security. We've built something here that actually works, he said. A protective sphere that keeps the peace through strength rather than hopeful diplomacy. Why would we abandon it? The council members exchanged glances that revealed their growing understanding of the situation. They had invited wolves into their home to drive away the monsters, and now the wolves were explaining why they needed to stay. You're occupying? Sovereign space, Chancellor Mordic stated, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had governed the galaxy for decades. These systems belong to their original inhabitants, not to Earth. We're securing strategic assets, Park replied, his tone remaining calm and diplomatic. The galaxy is safer with human oversight. Our forces have eliminated 17 separate threats in the past month, alone pirate fleets, rogue AI constructs, and territorial disputes that could have escalated into system-wide conflicts. The statistics were undeniable. Human-controlled. Space had become the most stable region in the galaxy, with trade flowing freely and conflicts resolved quickly through overwhelming force. But stability came at a price that the Council was only beginning to understand. What about our autonomy? Asked Ambassador Cathara of the Peaceful Collective. Our right to govern ourselves? Autonomy is earned through strength, Captain Nam replied. We offer protection to those who accept human guidance, and we defend our allies against those who threaten galactic peace. The meeting continued for hours, but the conclusion was inevitable. The human delegation listened politely to the Council's concerns, acknowledged their points with diplomatic courtesy, then explained in careful detail why those concerns were irrelevant. As the session ended, Admiral Hyen's message was transmitted to every corner of the galaxy through the Council's communication network. The transmission was brief, professional, and absolutely clear in its implications. The Terran hegemony exists to protect galactic civilization, the message stated. We will maintain our presence in liberated territories as long as threats to galactic peace continue to exist. We welcome cooperation from all species who share our commitment to stability and order. The council members filed out of the chamber in silence, each one understanding that the galaxy had changed forever. They had hoped for salvation and received conquest instead. The Galactic Council chamber looked smaller now, though its dimensions had not changed. Perhaps it was the presence of human security forces stationed at every entrance. Or maybe it was the way the assembled representatives seemed to shrink into their seats as they waited for the session to begin. 6 months had passed since the last emergency meeting, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that none of them had imagined possible. Ambassador. Li Sunhei entered the chamber with the confident stride of someone who no longer needed to ask permission for anything. Her uniform was immaculate, bearing the golden insignia of the Terran hegemony, and her eyes held the calm satisfaction of absolute victory. Behind her walked a delegation of human officers, each one representing a different aspect of Earth's expanding influence throughout the galaxy. The holographic display that dominated the center of the chamber flickered to life, showing a map that made the council members gasp in collective shock. The familiar territory of the old Galactic Council had been replaced by something entirely new. Human-controlled space now extended across 3 galactic arms, with Earth's fleets patrolling. Systems that had never seen an alien warship before the Devourer War. Honored representatives, Li began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for the dominant power in the galaxy. We gather today to discuss the future of galactic civilization. The old order has proven inadequate to the challenges we face. Chancellor Mordic rose from his seat, his forearms trembling with barely controlled emotion. He had ruled the Galactic Council for 2 centuries, had seen the rise and fall of dozens of civilizations, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Ambassador Li, we must discuss the terms of human withdrawal from occupied territories, he said, his voice carrying the desperate hope of someone who still believed in negotiation. There will be no withdrawal, Li replied simply. The galaxy faces a choice: voluntary integration into our protective sphere, or continued resistance to the natural order. The words hung in the chamber like a death sentence. Ambassador Veltar of the Axiom Collective rose from his crystalline chair, his translator crackling with static that indicated extreme distress among his people. Natural order? He demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. You were supposed to help us defend ourselves? We called you for aid, not conquest. Major Cho. Minho stepped forward, his metals gleaming in the chamber's artificial light. Each decoration told the story of battles fought against enemies the Council had never heard of, threats that had been eliminated before they could even be reported. We did defend you, he said, with the quiet pride of someone who had exceeded all expectations. We defended you so well that you'll never need to worry about threats again. The irony was not lost on the Council members. The species they had begged for salvation had become their new masters, and they had done so while claiming to protect the very people they now ruled. What about our sovereignty? Chancellor Mordic asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Our right to govern ourselves? Sovereignty is a luxury for those strong enough to protect it, Li replied, her tone remaining diplomatic despite the brutal honesty of her words. We offer something better: security under human guidance. Captain Han Soyang moved to stand beside the holographic display, her finger pointing to sectors that glowed with the peaceful blue light of stable systems. Every world under Terran protection enjoys unprecedented peace, she explained. Trade flows freely between systems. Conflicts are resolved efficiently through proper mediation, and threats are eliminated before they can develop into larger problems. The statistics were undeniable. Human-controlled space had become the most prosperous region in the galaxy, with economic growth rates that exceeded anything the old Council had ever achieved. But the cost of that prosperity was becoming increasingly clear. At what cost? Whispered Ambassador Cathara of the Peaceful Collective, her voice barely audible above the chamber's atmospheric processors. At the cost of learning that peace requires strength, Li answered. Your old system of governance through consensus and compromise failed when faced with a real threat. The Devourers nearly destroyed galactic civilization while you debated proper procedures. The chamber fell silent as the truth of her words sank in. The Galactic Council had spent months arguing about the best way to respond to the Devourer threat. While entire star systems were being consumed, it had taken human intervention to save them, and now they were learning that salvation came with a price. We offer membership in the Terran hegemony to any species that accepts our guidance, Major, Cho continued. Full citizenship, protection from all threats, and participation in the most successful civilization the galaxy has ever known. And if we refuse? Chancellor Mordic asked. Then you remain free to govern yourselves, Li replied with a smile. That did not reach her eyes, as long as your activities do not threaten galactic stability. The meeting continued for hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. The human delegation listened politely to the council's protests, acknowledged their concerns with diplomatic courtesy, and then explained in careful detail why those concerns were irrelevant in the new galactic order. As the session ended, the council members filed out of the chamber in defeat. They had hoped to defend their galaxy, and instead had given it away to the only species strong enough to protect it. The galaxy had hoped to defend itself, but Earth had chosen to conquer instead.